It's nefarious, man. Like, the brain works in fucked up ways.
The mind is one of the most deceiving, manipulative pieces of equipment, flesh, human bodies on earth. I never have trusted my brain.
All of that weight lives in your head, and you are the decision maker.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
Hi, it's Ronsley. If this is your first volume, welcome. This is a weekly series where I go inside the mind of an entrepreneur, artist, athlete, academic to decipher what is the psychology of our decisions. I'm Australian, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians throughout Australia and recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. Actually, I'll let my guest today acknowledge our land, our home.
I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara people, south of the Mardawa River, also known as the Brisbane River, here in Brisbane, in Queensland, in this beautiful country now known as Australia. I'd like to also acknowledge the Turrbal people north of the Mardawa River. The Yagara and the Turrbal people have been living and practicing their culture for tens of thousands of years. I want to acknowledge their elders past and present. And I also want to acknowledge traditional owners from right across the world, from wherever you're listening to this podcast. It's great to have your company.
Today, we're talking with...
My name is Mundanara. I'm a Gungaloo Birrigubba woman on my father's side. I'm a Wanneroo Bunjalung woman on my mother's side, born and raised in Redfern, in the heart of Sydney. 8 sisters from the block. First generation that wasn't forcibly removed, but 5 generations, all of my mother's grandmothers connected to Redfern, right? So Redfern is very special to me, even though I live in Queensland. I've got 5 children. They love basketball. They love football. My daughter does gymnastics. My husband's a Kiwi-born Fijian, so we go for New Zealand sometimes in the rugby. Then we go for Fiji. Sometimes we go for Australia, but we usually go for Fiji or New Zealand. And our kids at home speak bits of the Fijian language. They know how to say hello and thank you and please and goodbye. They speak bits of my mother's language, and we speak English as well. They know a lot of the Māori language. So my kids are very proud Aboriginal Kiwi Fijians.
Today's guest is Mundanara Bayles, and this powerhouse dropped so much knowledge that we had to make 2 volumes. If you are a regular listener of the show, you'll know that since the Black Lives Matter rally in Brisbane, for context, if you don't know what that is, this is what Sky News Australia reported on the 6th of June 2020 about that rally.
Let's go live to Brisbane and check in with Anna Rawlings. It's been a mostly peaceful protest there, Anna, today. How has it been in the later parts?
Louise, the protest has finished here. There's just a couple of hundred people left, despite there being reports of 30,000 attending the march today. Now, there were a couple of incidents a little later on towards the end of the march. The crowd stopped briefly at South Bank Police Station there. They had threatened not to move on unless the officer in charge came out with an Aboriginal flag. We also saw a small group graffiti and actually tag the building with "No justice, no peace." The police did take notes and take photos, but they chose not to physically intervene there. In another incident, as the crowds were beginning to disperse and the splinter groups were walking away, a member of one of those smaller groups, a man actually ran towards a police car. He began to bang on the bonnet. He jumped on the roof. Other people were calling for him to come back. He was eventually chased by police nearby. He was detained, but he wasn't arrested. So aside from those incidents, it has been a largely peaceful protest. It's what attendees and organisers had said. They didn't want there to be any sort of violence. They wanted their message to be able to be heard. Now, after the crowd marched through the city's streets, starting from King George Square and walking through the city over Victoria Bridge to over here in South Bank, we've now heard from people who have addressed the crowd. There's been some emotional speeches. Let's take a listen.
423 or 33, they say, of deaths and costs in our Aboriginal community, black community, of the Arajara Aboriginal community right throughout Australia, Arajara, the Pamanyanka mob, all of our bloodlines, killed, murdered, criminal, insane by this society to let the lawyers and the barristers allowed us to happen.
So we can hear the emotion there. We did hear from other organisers, and there's been many recounts of stories of loss, one in particular being Cameron Doomadgee. He was a Palm Island Indigenous man who died during riots. He had severe injuries while in police custody, allegedly inflicted by a police officer. So there's also been calls, of course, for justice on a wider level for Indigenous deaths in custody, with over 400 over the past 20 years or so. So police had been prepared for things to be heightened. They had been concerned as well that there may have been agitators who would use the protest as a bit of a veil, so for any sort of violent activity. But aside from those isolated incidents I mentioned, it has been largely peaceful. Of course, another concern from authorities had been social distancing, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic. The Deputy Premier had encouraged people to wear masks if possible. The Premier had encouraged people to stay at home and show their support online. But of course, as we saw, many thousands turned out. They were, though, making an effort to wear face masks and hand out hand sanitizer, doing their best to be as socially distant as possible in crowds the size that we saw today.
Anna Rawlings there live in Brisbane. Thank you very much for the update.
It is really important to understand what and how things are reported. Context and perspective is everything. That is why on this show, we present as much of what is covered as possible. We are as extensive as we can be with our research, and while the millions of Australians heard that on their television, here's a story about that day you wouldn't have heard.
So the company I run, Black Card, with the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm sitting here at home and I just thought, what are we going to do? We're going to turn up, and I got some T-shirts printed and everything. But what are we going to do as an organisation? How can we support the community? So I got these big, huge posters made. One of them, I got like 20 done. One was $30, right? So these are not just a normal poster. These are big placards, right? And I got them huge. So when you see any of the footage on the stage in the King George Square with all those big faces of all, that was my company. That's what we wanted to do to contribute to this movement so that we could humanize the movement, right? But my children sitting here in my lounge room while we're creating I'm approving the text, and I'm emailing families, ringing families, asking for permission, hearing them cry and saying thank you for doing this for our son or our daughter, our mum. That was hard for me, man, that week, because I was, for the very first time, I was engaging with the families that were still fighting for justice for their loved ones, right? Then I got posters printed, big posters, small posters. I spent about $5,000 on printing, right? We probably made 10 grand profit, my company, last financial year. We probably made 400 the year before. We're not government funded. And this is what I just knew we had to do something more than just turning up with our T-shirts on and our sign. So my children started asking me, Mum, who was Elijah? Who was Miss Dew? Who was Doomadgee? They're asking about these faces. And then I started telling them. And then I started thinking, man, is this too much for an 8 and 9-year-old to be processing? Then the next day, one of my staff members who was designing the posters for me, she rang me in the morning. She's a white Australian girl married to my cousin. She has 2 Aboriginal kids. She rang me in the morning and she said, Sis, I had nightmares all night. She said every face on all of those posters, they just, and she was, when she first was doing the posters, she was Googling them and trying to find out the cause of death. And when I realised she was writing all of the injuries, I said, no. That's too much. Name, date of birth, the day they died, just leave it like that. That's enough. And she said, Sis, I think I need to take a day off. I can't think. I haven't stopped crying. And I've never had to really face this part of our history. I've never even thought about this. Even as a woman married to an Aboriginal man and working in an Aboriginal organisation, this was too much for her. And I I felt so bad that, you know what, here I am just thinking this is just an activity. We're just going to a protest, get me some posters, send it to our printer. I didn't realise the impact that it had on her own mental health. So she had 2 days off. And when she came back, she just said to me, I don't know how you do it. She said, you know, that last couple of days of just doing those posters was too much. When she's seen on the news, all of the people, and she was spotting the posters. She said, I felt so good that we did that. You know, we was able to put faces to these names, not just 430 plus deaths in custody, not just talking about a royal commission in 1991 and all of the recommendations that haven't been implemented. There was faces. You know, Elijah was 14. TJ Hickey was 17. Miss Jew was 22. I wanted people to realise that these were people's children. You know, these were people's big brothers, big sisters, aunties, uncles. These were people that were part of our families and communities, not just names on a royal inquiry or names on the internet that you can Google that have lost their lives to the system. They were human beings.
Since 1991, at least 437 Indigenous Australians have died in police custody. Despite making up around 3% of the total population of Australia, Indigenous adults are 15 times more likely to be incarcerated than non-Indigenous Australians.
Very earlier on in our conversation, I asked Mundanara about the basic stuff. What was the basic stuff we needed to know?
Well, the basic stuff is we need to acknowledge that this country was invaded instead of referring to our history in this country as settlement. It's just sugarcoating things to make white Australians feel good about their own history in this country. So they need to acknowledge their own history and their ancestors, whether they were part of the atrocities, the massacres, the bloodshed, the stealing of children, the raping, the murdering, you know, the horrific things that happened to our people in this country. They need to come to terms with that. We need to start with the truth of what happened when they stood foot on our shore. They don't want to acknowledge it. And when you dig deep into it, I don't know if I would want to acknowledge it either if that was my ancestors.
Let that sit with you for a second. History has been known to be changed to reflect glory. But who is writing these history books? Which history book will tell you that?
I'm the first generation on my mother's side that wasn't forcibly removed. That's how recent our history is in this country. It wasn't 200 years ago. I'm the first generation that wasn't taken from my mother and father because I have an Irish grandfather and I have a Scottish ancestor on my father's side. My mother was taken, her mother was taken, her grandmother was taken, her great-grandmother was taken. That trauma, I've got 5 generations of trauma that now I've inherited that I don't want my children to inherit. So yeah, I would say that in terms of trauma, it's real, generational trauma. When I think about grandmothers that are still alive, a majority of those women suffered horrific trauma, you know, under the policy of the day. And the government needs to take accountability, not just for taking the children, but what happened to them, why they were sent out to work. My nan was sent out to work. By the age of 10, right, they're in a domestic training school to learn how to be a little black slave at 10. The education that they were provided was up to grade 3 because that's all they needed to know in order to be employable. They turn up to a property and there could be up to 200 men working on that cattle station, and there could be 3 or 4 or 5 little black domestics. And these little girls are, you know, most of them are under the age of 14. What do you think happened to these young girls? They're our grandmothers. They're still alive today. So this is within their living memories, and it's their lived experience that needs to be acknowledged, and the truth needs to be told. These stories need to be told. These conversations need to be had, and it needs to be written in our history books. The real history, our shared history, not the Aboriginal version of history. So I want to acknowledge our grandmothers, because through all of that, my nan took this to her grave with her. She didn't get to see the day that Kevin Rudd, whatever he did, said it, did the apology, read it.
If you don't know about the apology, we have covered the entire apology in the Mark Yadika Paulson volume. But do you know Maureen Watson, also known as Auntie Maureen? She was a tireless educator and campaigner for the rights of her people, Aboriginal people. Gifted and passionate, she was a performer on stage and in film, a poet, an author and playwright, children's author, beloved mother, grandmother and great-grandmother, and a recognized Maori elder in Southeast Queensland.
My grandmother, her name was Maureen Watson. You Google her. Amazing woman. She's won United Nations awards for peace and reconciliation back in the 90s. She won this prestigious Red Ochre Award, which was a $50,000 prize. She was internationally known and respected. One-woman theatre shows in London sold out, right? This is back in the 90s. My grandmother, storyteller, activist, actress in theatre, amazing woman, right? In the 1980s, my dad's brother took her down to the Mara Hospital, right? Which is right next door to our Aboriginal Health Service on Ennerley Road. My dad's younger brother, took my grandmother down there. And my grandmother, very dark woman. He turns up with her and he says to the nurse, my mother's really sick. Like she's can't stand, she's losing balance, she's delusional, she's really unwell. And the nurse said, oh, she looks like she's drunk. And he said, listen, miss, my mother has never drank. She needs to see a doctor and she's really ill. She says, oh, look, she must be on drugs then. Take her home to sleep. And he said, listen, if I have to smash this place up, he grabs a chair, bang, starts smashing a chair, boom, she presses the buzzer, everyone comes out. And man, he was not going to let his mother die at home, like a lot of Aboriginal people have, because they not only did they not get the service or the treatment that they needed, they were turned away full stop without even a doctor or being triaged. Check the temperature. Everyone that turns up into an emergency department, you should be triaged. They would have known from her temperature straight away she's not well. She was diagnosed with viral meningitis, and they said she was about 24 to 48 hours away from dying, right? She was so lucky that she lived. So for about 1 month, she was life support. And there was a lot of times where family said their goodbyes to my grandmother. And she just woke up one day. Amazing, right? That was in the 1980s in Brisbane. This is a woman who has done so much for our country, done so much internationally to bring people together. And that's the treatment she got in her own country, right?
When we come back, why is politics and the government and our leaders so important when it comes to change?
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
The main objective of this audio project is to bring together entrepreneurs and creators who share similar values so that they can find the courage to put out their authentic voice for the right people to hear, which allows for them to make their impact on the world. Every great movement started with a memorable speech. For access to full-length interviews, go to psychologyofentrepreneurship.com and click the button.
Mundanara, I would love some perspective on how the government plays their role.
The government is to blame because, with the vote yes for equal rights for gay, LGBTIQ, see the investment from society, from corporate Australia, from government. I saw campaigns everywhere. I'm back of the buses here in Brisbane. I saw the rainbow lanyards around a lot of people that I was meeting with, going to their organisations for workshops. I saw a lot of resources to educate people. With the apology, there was no investment to bring Australia with us, to bring Australia or the Australian society or the Australian community, the wider community. They weren't part of this kind of journey that kind of led to an apology. They weren't really part of the journey that led to reconciliation and that movement. They've kind of been left in the dark. So they still don't understand and therefore don't think it's their business.
It is our business. With that as context and perspective, I asked Mundanara for a specific example.
So Close the Gap was born 2008. The apology happened and they realised, we've got a whole lot of stuff here that, now the public and international, people around the world are aware of now. The suicide rates, the fact that Aboriginal people are the most incarcerated people on the planet, right? So in terms of Close the Gap, there was these measures around closing the gap in terms of life expectancy, incarceration rates, employment, infant death, mortality rates. So with the Close the Gap policy, there was these areas that the government invested in so that within a generation we could close the gap. I think it was 25 years we could close the gap. So if I was Tennis Australia and I wanted to apply for funding, right, to roll out tennis camps, clinics around Queensland, around, Aboriginal communities and get them engaged in sport and rec, I would go to the Department of Sport and Rec, a state government body, and apply under the funding and meet their criteria. If I wanted to do something in health, I would go to Queensland Health. If I wanted to do something in education, so you get what I'm saying. The Queensland government, those different departments, they administered funding for any Aboriginal programs that came under their portfolio. When Tony Abbott came in, he said, no. I will control every dollar from my department and I'll become, the expert in Indigenous affairs. He literally took us back 20 years.
So wait, backwards? How backwards?
What happened, right, is he basically streamlined all of the funding so that his department had 5 programs that you can apply for funding. 5 programs. Before it was about 200 different programs you could apply for funding from all the different state government departments, right? And then it was 5 streams of funding. But the Aboriginal organisations all around the country, if they were providing counselling services to the community, they would apply for their funding through the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, the IAS funding, through the Prime Minister and Cabinet, which was Tony Abbott at the time. They were competing with people like Relationships Australia, Mission Australia, Anglicare, Centrecare, Uniting Care, all of the big church groups. Who do you think won the funding? The little Aboriginal organisations that have the clients, that have the relationships, that have the expertise, that have the Aboriginal staff, that have that lived experience and understanding? No. So those little organisations, about 50% of them across the country, had to shut their doors. So even more in terms of going backwards, our people don't engage with mainstream services. And there's a reason why we don't engage with mainstream services, because those services were never set up for us to participate in or for us to be part of, right? So we're not welcomed.
You know, a lot of the times we get surprised by information because we feel that can't happen in Australia. Well, get ready to be surprised again. This is Khadija on the TED stage talking about FGM, female genital mutilation.
I am the lucky girl. There's so many women out there who have gone through FGM who have infertility. I know a 9-year-old girl who has incontinence, constant infections, pain. It's that gift. It doesn't stop giving. It affects every area of your life. And this happened to me because I was born a girl in the wrong place. That's why it happened to me. I channeled all that anger, all that pain into advocacy because I needed my pain to be worth something. So I'm the director of an organization called No FGM Australia. You heard me right. Why No FGM Australia? FGM is in Australia. 2 days ago, I had to call Child Protective Services because somewhere in Australia, there's a 4-year-old whose mom is planning on performing FGM on her. That child is in kindy. I'll let that sink in. 4 years old.
Female genital mutilation is a traditional practice that involves a partial or total removal of external female genitalia or other injury to female genital organs for non-medical reasons. The aim of this practice, which can often result in infections, shock, bleeding, chronic pain, reproductive issues, and even death alongside mental health conditions, is typically to inhibit a woman's sexual feelings. Statistics show that over 200 million girls and women alive today have been subjected to the practice, usually before the age of 15. In Australia, it is illegal to perform FGM. It is also illegal to witness a practice and to either take or arrange to take a child or Australian resident overseas for the practice. Although it is illegal, it is estimated that around 0.4% of Australia's overall female population have received this procedure.
There are separate health services for Aboriginal people because, well, just recollect that story about Maureen Watson in the hospital. And there are specific issues like mental health. But at what point does your disbelief turn into sadness and then into anger?
I've been really concerned about their mental health. And we're quite lucky, Ronsley, because we have in Southeast Queensland, we have about 20 Aboriginal owned and controlled health services, right? So we look after our own mob and we do a really good job at that. And I think when you're looking at our life expectancy in Queensland, because we have so many Aboriginal health services, because we're taking healthcare to the people. Instead of having one central service, all of our healthcare is where Aboriginal people are. So we look at the population and we go, boom, we need to build another medical centre here. We look at the population over here and we build. So we're getting really good. You know, Aboriginal people, we've been through a lot, but I tell you what, we're starting to really take control of our own destinies in areas that we can, right? These Aboriginal health services that are doing the phones, they're doing the home visits, they're making sure our elders are okay, they're doing food parcels, they're dropping off food, they're doing Woolworths and Coles vouchers. You know, our community have made sure basically that our old people, especially our old people and our most vulnerable in our community, are looked after, and that they know that that they've got that support available to them. So we're quite lucky. If we didn't have our own Aboriginal health services, I would say the suicide rate would be through the roof, even though it is through the roof amongst Aboriginal society. Like the leading contributing factor in terms of Aboriginal deaths between 15 and 35 years old is suicide. The leading cause of death. amongst Aboriginal people between the age of 15 and 35 is suicide.
So if the system doesn't get you, you get you. Unfortunately, that's the case for our Aboriginal people. But how has COVID-19 and the lockdown affected our Aboriginal people?
In terms of COVID and in terms of trauma, that has re-traumatized people, because up until the 70s here in Queensland, Aboriginal people were still literally living on reserves, which were no different to concentration camps, right? They were living on reserves, and every aspect of their lives was controlled by the state. Every aspect, where they worked, if they could marry, if they could have their children, if they could see their children, if they could access their own money from working. So could you imagine being in that position where every aspect of your life is controlled? The old people talk about their lives were controlled by the bells. So a bell will ring in the morning, up you get. The next bell would ring, the next part. The next bell would ring, they eat. Next bell. The whole day, it was about the bells. And they still talk about this. So when COVID first hit, our Aboriginal people were very, very vulnerable because it attacks the respiratory. And the leading contributing factor in terms of premature death amongst Aboriginal society is respiratory disease. So very vulnerable. So the Aboriginal communities, especially here in Queensland, they enacted the Biosecurity Act before the Queensland government even said, what are you guys doing? They took measures into their own hands and they locked down the communities. But then once kind of people were, okay, this is what's happening and we're protecting you, those people, say in Cherbourg, 4 hours out of Brisbane, that's one of the oldest running reserves in the country. I think in the 70s, they got their freedom, whatever freedom means, right? But as they started to get used to this COVID and lockdown, when they were allowed to leave Cherbourg, I heard that there was the army, people at the entrance of the community, basically like a checkpoint. And you're allowed to leave for 2 hours max. And it takes half an hour, 20 minutes to half an hour to go into Mergen, which is the closest town, to get their groceries and stuff. So half an hour in and half an hour back. So that meant that they had 1 hour to get their essentials and get back to the community. Just imagine having armed forces at the entrance of your community and you were alive during the time that you was on that reserve with barbed wire fence. Children were taken, the boys over here, the girls over there, barbed wire between you so that you may be able to see your children, maybe through the fence. So the re-traumatization, I'm not too sure if that's the word I'm looking for, but it has triggered a lot of trauma and a lot of emotions for a lot of our people in Aboriginal communities, and not just in Aboriginal communities where they were restricted and confined to, but even in urban settings, right? If you've got people that lived during that time and are still around.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
Coming up on the psychology of entrepreneurship.
The acknowledgement of country is the most visible feature of Aboriginal culture today.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
The next person, she says, I'm from Rockhampton too. He says, really? They work together. They've been in the architecture industry, working in that profession for years, and they did not even know that their families were both from Rockhampton. You want to talk about diversity and inclusion, which nearly every organisation has a policy around. Well, yeah, we've got the diversity right, but do we feel included?
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
I interviewed Mundanara because Mundanara Bayles is the managing director and co-founder of Black Card. She co-founded Black Card with Dr. Leah Watson, who is a respected Aboriginal elder, artist, educator, and longtime course developer. She also founded Deadly Futures, an event designed to provide opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons seeking employment, including further education opportunities. She has more than 18 years of experience working for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations in Queensland and New South Wales. She has an amazing TED Talk that you just have to watch. Mundanara is a mother, entrepreneur, and a proud advocate for her people.
Psychology of entrepreneurship.
This is a Must Amplify production. Special thanks to every guest expert that has appeared on the show. Editing, voiceovers, and sound design by Kaylee Bunnyman and Tiago Vega. Guest research and content by Claire Gould and Corinne Castles. Project managed by Kaylee Bunnyman. Produced and hosted by me, Ronsley Vaz. For more episodes and where to listen, go to mustamplify.com/POE.
Hey, it's Kaylee from Must Amplify. I'm the sound engineer for this volume of Psychology of Entrepreneurship. I'm part of the team that made this production come alive. I work as a part of a global team with our studios based in West End, Brisbane, Australia. If you would like a podcasting checklist, email me at kaylee@amplifyagency.media. That's KAILI@amplifyagency.media. We specialize in finding your voice and making sure it's heard by the right people. If you are considering whether a podcast is a good idea for your business, check out our other show on shouldistartapodcast.com.